I worry that people are giving away their ability and desire to think for themselves. And the question there becomes, how does it affect us as a whole society, right? And then what kind of vibe are we creating as a collective society, where we're no longer thinking for ourselves? We don't even write songs, we don't write poems, we don't think about anything whatsoever. We outsource it to my phone or to my computer. And then what does that say about us as a people? What does that say about us as a society? What does that say about the vibe that we're generating on a daily basis? And that's the things that I worry about, right? And how can we use technology in a way that is safe, that is helpful, but at the same time, though, doesn't erase what makes us human?
Welcome to the table. You're tuned into the Academic Boardroom with Dr. J and Dr. E. Pull up a chair. Higher learning, higher stakes.
Welcome back to the Academic Boardroom, where we sit down with power brokers shaping the future of education. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Joseph, and joining me is my colleague and partner in crime, Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. Today, we have a special guest by the name of Dr. Jason Delgandio. Jason is a professor of communications at Temple University and an award-winning educator who has spent over 30 years studying the theory and practice of vibes. An interesting conversation that we're about to have here. An expert in social justice, activism, and collective energy, Jason is the creator of the educational platform 20 Minute Vibe. His insights have been featured in the New York Times, and his highly anticipated upcoming book is titled Vibe Talk: How and Why We Communicate About Vibes. Jason, welcome to the boardroom.
Hi, guys. How you doing?
We're good. We're
Hey,
good.
it's wonderful to have you. So I'm really curious about your background and your upbringing. Like, how did you get into the study of vibes? How did you grow up? What was your, educational journey like? Could you share a little bit more about that with us?
Yeah, sure. So my upbringing was pretty basic and common. I grew up in a working class family. I really had no aspirations of ever becoming a college professor. That was not really part of my trajectory. Never thought that would ever happen. But I did grow up in a household, though, where the word vibe was used on a regular basis, and we all knew what it meant. And just like you would say it, and you kind of just knew what everyone was talking about. But then, really, it was my late teens when I started to participate in a variety of subcultures and countercultures. So the early rave scene in New York City, following bands on tour, house parties, underground parties, things like that. And all of these scenes and subcultures, the word vibe was used. So the vibe of the band, the vibe of the DJ, the vibe of the dance floor, the vibe of whatever. And I used the word myself. But at some point, I realized that no one was really explaining it or defining it. And so I took up an intellectual interest in this thing we call the vibe at a very early age, around 18 or 19. I was asking these kinds of questions like, what is this thing that we're all talking about and experiencing? Then I wrote my first paper in a college class on the vibe in nonverbal communication. That was really my first attempt. And then I went to graduate school and used my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation to construct my own philosophy of the vibe, referred to as bodily emanation. And move forward 30 years later, and here I am, the intellectual vibe guy, and I say that with nothing but humor and fun. So
We tend to have different um, interpretation of what vibe is, and I think it's pretty similar and common in retrospect. But I was wondering, when you were growing up in school, can you tell the vibe of certain professors or whether or not you're going to do well or you're going to vibe with this class and this professor as well?
Or
Or
even like before that, I'm so curious, like when you developed this gift for detecting like, were you in elementary school or was it when you were older where you recognized that? And also, how do you define vibes?
all right, so lots of questions
yeah,
at once, lots of questions. All right. So in terms of my personal experience, right? I don't know when I first developed this ability to feel a quote unquote vibe, but it was always second nature to me. Like I never had to think about it, right? From an early age, it is what it is. I could feel the presence for the people. I could feel what was going on with my parents or whatever it is. I don't think I called it a vibe at the time, but in retrospect, upon reflection, I realized I could feel this thing we call a vibe, right? Um, Now, I don't want to get too personal here, but like I did experience early childhood trauma, and it's common for people to experience trauma where they develop a secondary sense to keep themselves safe, right? Now, I don't want to reduce the vibe to that, but in terms of my own journey, that's part of my journey. Right. Um, then as I got older, though, and the word became more prominent, I assumed everyone felt a vibe. But as I've gotten older, that's not necessarily the case. In other words, not everyone that I've encountered in my life says they know what I'm talking about. Right. So to be very reductive here, I think in the world there's two kinds of people. There's vibes people and non-vibes people. I'm obviously a vibes person. Right. Um, Now, in terms of how I define a vibe, the most basic way to define it is the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. Now, the first question to ask though is like, what is the nature of this energy? Right? So is a vibe physical or metaphysical? Is it material or immaterial? Is it scientific or is it spiritual? Or is it all these things at the same time? Right. And I pose that as a question because I want your listeners to think about this for themselves. Right. Depending upon your orientation to the world and your personal philosophy, you may side on with one perspective about this or side with another perspective about this, but we can agree upon something's happening in this interaction, in this exchange. Right. And so hence I say it's the exchange of energy between people, and that can be defined and understood in different kinds of ways relative to your own background and worldview. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we all know what it means. Like we have our own definition, or the like the energy, and I think it's become a popular word now. But could you tell us more? I'm so curious about your classes and like what they entail around this idea of vibes and even, maybe how do you advise students, right? If someone comes to you and says, I don't vibe with my, or I don't gel with my professor or another classmate, do you also provide guidance on how to navigate when the vibes just, your vibes and their vibes are not vibing?
Sure. So I want to clarify that I don't teach any classes at Temple about vibes, right?
Okay.
As you might imagine, most academic institutions are probably not open to that, right?
Hmm.
So most of my classes at Temple focus on basic communication courses like persuasion, argumentation, public speaking, more advanced courses on activism, social movement, social justice, civil disobedience, things like that. Now, the word vibe might come up in class naturally, right? That's fine, but I don't teach a class about vibes. Now, maybe one day I will. That would be awesome, right? But that's not necessarily what I'm teaching there. But as a more, let's say, everyday example, though, if we talk about a student says, "Well, Professor J, I'm in this class. I'm not vibing with the professor. What do I do?" It's like, well, let's think through this, right? Like, is it that you're giving off the wrong vibe in the wrong kind of a way with the professor? Is it that the professor is just what's the word I'm looking for? That we're is just not a cool person. Let's put it that way, right? Just not it's not a fun person, not cool, right? Or is it a relational dynamic? I mean, we can think about this in different kinds of ways, and the vibe is not just from one source to one receiver; it's a relational phenomenon. So in that case, it's like, well, how might I adapt my vibe to this class to get through the next 14, 15 weeks and do the best I can, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Oh,
that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I wasn't thinking you were teaching a class per se, but I assume in communication it comes up. And then also I know you mentioned persuasion, so I think that it's really fascinating to think about from those perspectives. And I'm sure naturally it just sort of comes up and you'll probably find ways to infuse elements of your book when it comes out into your courses as well, because it seems like it's all related.
sure. And just to touch upon that briefly, the vibe is a phenomenon of communication, right? And you can use it as a form of communication. So, for instance, think of a good public speaker standing on stage, right? Most, not all, but most good public speakers have a stage presence to them. All right. And the question is, well, what is that stage presence? One way to understand stage presence is through the lens of this vibe and this energy that we're talking about. Right. The question from there becomes like, well, how do you develop and create your stage presence? Right? That's really what we're talking about, right? And so one of the ways that I think about is trying to be like a maestro, right? So you have to attune yourself to what the audience is feeling, but then find a way not just to feel what they're feeling, but to direct what they're feeling in that particular direction that benefits what you want to say and convince them about. Right. So how do you stand before tens or hundreds or even thousands of people and vibe with that audience in a way that uplifts them and carries them somewhere else they're not used to? And that's the mark of a good leader, a good speaker, a good stage presence, and so on.
Do you think it takes time to develop that skill? Or
Yes,
is
I do. Yes. Right now, strangely though, growing up, I never thought about it that way. Again, I thought everyone could feel what I feel, and I thought it was natural for everyone. But as I've thought about this over the years, though, the question is that's not true, right? Its question becomes about, like you said, how do we develop and craft this skill set to feel a vibe, use a vibe, attune to the vibe, direct a vibe, and so on. Right. So it really is a skill set, a practice, and a habit. I guess kind of like mindfulness and meditation. Right. So I started meditating about 10 or 12 years ago after my father passed away. I was emotionally a mess, I had to do something, right? And I finally sat down and tried to practice, and it takes work, right? But the more you work on it, you learn how to clear your mind, right, of the psychological clutter, get in touch with the inner self, and then move forward from there. And the same thing is true with the vibe, right? How do you attune yourself to these energies, these vibes of other people, and use that to your advantage?
I was wondering, in terms of social media, which social media platform do you vibe with the most? As far as the algorithm, as far as how you use it? I was wondering which social media platform do you think you can vibe with the most?
It's a good question. It's a fun question. It's a complicated answer, I guess. So, despite the fact that I consider myself to be an engaged intellectual and my work is mostly public facing, I'm not a big user of social media. But that's partially though because of the social context that we're in right now, right? It's just very draining. It's very toxic, and I just have better things to do with my time than be annoyed on the thing what I'm looking at on my phone, right? Now, having said that, um, maybe Instagram, right? I haven't really gotten to YouTube yet. I don't have a YouTube, not YouTube. So I haven't gotten to TikTok yet. I don't have a TikTok account. For some reason, I'm just not interested. Now, I'm not trying to throw shade to anyone whatsoever. It just doesn't intrigue me right now. Although my friends say I need to get on there. But I guess Instagram, it's more image based, things like that. Um, Now, though, if we change the question to, well, what's the relationship between social media and vibes? I think that's an interesting question, right?
Okay.
I think that social media definitely affects your vibe. How could it not, right? Social media affects your psychology, affects your emotions, it affects your outlook on life and the world around you, and that will inherently affect the vibe you give off to other people, right? And so I'm sure you all heard the phrase doom scrolling, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, if you doom scroll all day, you're going to give off a doomy vibe. That's just the nature of the situation, right? Whereas if you look at cat videos all day, you're going to give off a cat video vibe all day, right? So I would say be mindful of the social media you take in, and be mindful how it affects your energy and your vibe on a daily basis.
Yeah, I'm curious on that note around social media and, this question of AI. Because I think as someone who specializes in and teaches students about communication, how do you find or do you find that AI and social media are impacting kids' ability to communicate, um, maybe understand people? Because I saw, I'm sure you read or you've been hearing a lot of conversations around how people don't read anymore and how these young kids, they are not developing the critical thinking skills that are strengthened through reading because AI is summarizing things for them. Do you notice that in your classes as far as the students and how they communicate? Is that affected by AI? Are you noticing people, have like meme speak or GIF speak or just they're awkward in their social interactions?
Great question. It really is. I am in no way an expert on social media and AI, so I want to put that out front, right? Um, So let's say 10 or 12 years ago, this was a big discussion when, like, the early millennials, right? And they, in some ways, really the first generation to grow up on social media. Maybe not from the day one, but by the time you're in junior high and high school, and now you're in college, they were on social media. And early on, I found it really annoying because they wouldn't get off their phones. They just would not get off their phones. And you tell them to get off their phones, they cop an attitude about it, right? But I didn't notice any kind of developmental disabilities going on here. Like it was just they're just kids and they're on the phone. So what, right? And then that phase though kind of ended where now the kids in my classes later, a few years later, were more accustomed to putting their phones away. They learned how to do that, right? Now we're in another phase though where now we have Gen Z who literally grew up from day one on social media, But my analysis is, let's say, tainted because it's also an issue of it's the COVID kids coming into my class now, right? So during the COVID and everything shut down, the pandemic, they were at home, stuck at home on their phones literally all day long, right? And so in that sense, their behavior in the classroom is slightly off compared to previous generations because they think they can just sit there in front of the computer in the classroom and not respond non-verbally, not pay attention. But then the question for me is like, well, are they paying attention? Am I just seeing it differently because their nonverbals are different, right? And I don't know the answer to those questions, right? I mean, from your experience in this conversation here, how would you think about this relative to students in the classroom nowadays, the AI and social media and things like that?
That's a great question. I know for me in my classes, I struggle with assigning writing assignments to students because I can just tell, because I'm a writer, and I just can after reading just like you, just like Dr. E, so many papers, I can tell what's AI and what's not. So I just don't even assign things that would require them to try to use AI, and I try to do a lot of things in class where they can be able to articulate, because AI can't teach you. You can read a script from AI, but when you're presenting, you can't really so I try to do a lot more of those because I do find that even my attention span, because of doom scrolling I'm not a TikTok person either. I just don't like that app, but we are on the academic boardroom is on TikTok, but the doom scrolling on Instagram is and I notice like the way that people speak and how language, I'm just really interested in like language contagion and how something will catch on. And I do think that even like our emotional intelligence is being impacted by being on our phones. We don't know how to interact. I'm fascinated by like the dating, what young people say about dating, because I just hear from my friends who are, unpartnered, that the dating scene is just very vastly different. So I do think that there is the impacts of AI and social media, but like you said, I think COVID also accelerated what was already like happening.
I agree. On my end, I do pay attention. I don't post much, but I pay attention to patterns. And I like X a lot. I like Twitter X a lot because I notice that when I see content, right, and I see content, the first thing that you will see in the comment section is Grok. Is this real? Or Grok, can you tell me what this is all about? So I think it's interesting how someone who's using an app is no longer focused on what's going on or the content. They're focusing on AI to tell them what's going on with the content. And you kind of find that same pattern in school. So if you were to give them a written assignment, they would say, ChatGPT, can you generate this for me? Right. And I don't think that is a problem to a certain extent, but it's a problem when they are copying and pasting what ChatGPT tell them and then pasting it on and submitting it as if it's their own. And that's when it gets tricky a little bit because number one, you're not even you who submitted this. You're submitting this from a machine that you don't even know if it's correct. And at the very bottom, it says that it can make mistakes. This is an AI tool; it can make mistakes. Same with all the other AI tools. So it's interesting to see how people can, with the advent of AI, how people tend to rely on AI to tell them what's going on with either the content or with the class. They will they will actually record your lectures and then have the application tell them what's all about, which is fairly interesting. And I think when it comes to the topic of vibe, it's hard to get that physical, the true essence of what it is, the human essence of what it is that students should be getting from our classes.
Yeah, it's tough because I just think people aren't, it's not sharpening their critical thinking skills. Jason, I thought, or Dr. J, I thought you were also a millennial. Like you give me
I
millennial
am much
vibes.
older than that. I'm much older than that.
You give me, but I'm a millennial, and I remember, when you had to write an 11-page paper or 13, you had to sit as I was coming up, Spark Notes was starting to get popular, but you had to literally think critically about how you wanted to write and process. And just social media and AI specifically is like taking away that ability, which I do think impacts people's ability to communicate. Because if you're consulting with ChatGPT when you got in an argument with your friend and you just want advice, which I know people who do that, it's like instead of coming to your own conclusions, you're using AI to help you conflict, resolute when AI has no experience and it's just parsing out information online. So I do think it is impacting our ability to communicate, and I think making us less able because we're not communicating as much in person. I think it's like that skill you're not really practicing. I just saw that a popular women's magazine was caught using AI. They posted something. I think they were doing a call for they were looking for some writers for something, and the bottom had like the AI prompt, and so they had to delete it. But it was on X. People screenshotted it. So it's like even these well-known publications that are supposed to communicate information to us are leaning on AI. So I do think it's hurting our ability to communicate with each other. Um, and so I'm just interested with how things are going to be for these young kids who are in school now, who are maybe the COVID kids, and how they'll be able to communicate. And I guess that makes it more like your course or what you teach them on persuasion is even more important because social media is now persuading people, right? So we've lost that ability to understand how to persuade people maybe in person or when we communicate with them. So I guess it makes something like what you're teaching them even more valuable.
Yeah, yeah. And then just to tease that a little bit, so I'm not anti-technology, and I don't think you guys are either. Like, it's technology is part of our lives. We're human beings, and we use technology, and it can be great things, right? But with AI and whatnot, I worry that people are giving away their ability and desire to think for themselves, right? And the question there becomes, how does it affect us as a whole society, right? And then what kind of vibe are we creating as a collective society, right? Where we're no longer thinking for ourselves. We don't even write songs. We don't write poems. We don't think about anything whatsoever. We outsource it to my phone or to my computer. And then what does that say about us as a people, right? What does that say about us as a society? What does that say about the vibe that we're generating on a daily basis? And that's the things that I worry about, right? And how can we use technology in a way that is safe, that is helpful, but at the same time, though, doesn't erase what makes us human. And that's the things I'm concerned about.
I also want to piggyback on this note. When I look at certain social movements, right? When you think of like activism and what's going on, where someone is going to protest, do you feel like it's the vibes in terms of how people interact when it comes down to action? Is it different from there's no issues going on, or there's no movement, there's no action, no call to action? Do you think it's different, or do you feel as though it depends on what they're protesting, what is the issue here? And on top of that, because there's a difference between, let's say Target, the um the protest for Target. Do you think the people that are invested in that story and who are looking at that movement, do you think their vibes are different otherwise if you're following their patterns or the patterns of mass users?
So, do you mean in terms of like something like not motivation, like what's the word I'm looking for? Like a massive people is the individual thinking about these things by themselves.
Yeah.
Is that vibe different than massive people acting
Mhm.
together? The
Yes.
answer is definitely 100% yes. The answer is definitely yes, right? Based on my experience anyway, right? There's something unique about the co-presence of bodies acting in public. Right?
Mhm.
So again, something unique about the co-presence of bodies acting in public together, right? As opposed to one individual. Now, one individual can have a major impact. I mean, we can point to history about that, right? But when the average person witnesses hundreds or thousands of people acting together, psychologically makes me think, well, why am I not with them? Right? Or conversely, are they critiquing me based on about my racism, my sexism, my classism, whatever the case may be, right? So when human beings witness these bodies in public, right, they get a sense of that vibe, and that vibe, that collective vibe within the movement, motivates those people to do more, right? They become more committed. They develop what's referred to maybe as an affective relationship or an affective network, right? A certain kind of social bond where now we feel like we're in this together, and this effort has the potential to make the world a better place, right? And that's hard to achieve by yourself. You can do that, but we're human beings, we're social creatures, right? And we take our cues from other people. And so if people are reinforcing what we're doing and what we believe in, we're more likely to carry through with that. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm not entirely sure.
No, yeah, it does. It does. I was also thinking about how does it carry on to political, in the political world as well,
Sure.
when you have the upcoming elections
Yep.
and you have, two polarizing candidates that you're
Yep.
picking and choosing from. Is it pretty much the same as well?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The vibe? Okay.
Now, I want to clarify this, that the movements that I tend to focus on and study and promote, I perceive as being very positive movements for positive social change. There's a dark side of this, though, as well. All right. So, what we perceive to be just and not just, and what we perceive to be a good vibe and a bad vibe, is relative to your politics, unfortunately. Right? I'm trying to be very abstract. I'm not sure what I can and cannot say on your show, so I'm trying to be respectful, right? But you could have two social movements that politically are diametrically opposed to each other, and each one thinks they're in the right, that they have the answers, and that they are achieving social justice. Now, to clarify what I just said there, and to use a concrete example, when I think that may not be so controversial, right? Years ago, when I first got involved with actors, I'm talking like 20 years ago, I was at a protest, and counter protesters showed up, and they were members of the Westboro Baptist Church, right? And this is a group of people that are infamous for their anti-gay hatred, and they would tell you this themselves. I'm not making this up, right? I knew who they were, but I'd never seen them in person. In that moment, though, the vibe they were giving off, I've never felt that before in my life. It's 20 years later, I'm still talking about it, right? It was a vibe of hatred, like literally bona fide embodied hatred, right? And so I'd like to think that that vibe they're giving off is not the same vibe as movements that I'm part of. Black Lives Matter, feminism, climate justice, so on and so on and so on. Now, I'm not saying that these latter movements can't be enraged and angry, but anger and hatred are not the same thing, not the same vibe. Does that all make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
I also find it. I'm sorry to keep asking questions of consecutively, but I was wondering, um, and I always look at groups of people protesting and what they believe in, which may be opposing to what you may feel. But if you were to pick them out and you see one of them, I'm pretty sure their vibe is different when it's one versus 100, 150, 200. And it's tricky because now it can be confusing in terms of what that one person may really feel and their vibe as well. Because if I am, let's take that as an example. I am completely against gay rights and whatnot, right? But I'm with a group of people. It's totally different when I'm by myself. You catch me by myself,
Yeah.
and now all of a sudden it's, hey, I have a different I have a different view and a different perspective, but now it's tricky because now it's confusing in terms of what I actually believe in.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
what based on what you're asking, Dr. E, it's similar to what I was wondering, which is Dr. J, how many, or since you study social movements, do you feel like a large portion of people who join movements, whether they're positive for social good or they're against the rights of a marginalized group of people, what percentage or how many of those, what percentage is a better question, of those people do you think join because those are their legitimate beliefs versus they want to be part of a group? Because I'm thinking of like hearing from, I'm fascinated by people who identify as part of MAGA and what they believe. But when you hear them as individuals and you hear what they actually believe, it would sound similar to somebody who maybe is a socialist, right? They want this and they want that and they want that. But when they get into the group, the vibe is different. Do you find that a lot of people join social movements um I guess I feel like you understand what I'm asking, but I feel like a lot of people join social movements because those are genuinely their beliefs or because they want to be maybe part of a group that they never felt they were, part of a community before.
Wow, all really good questions. All really good questions. Right. Um, all right. People join movements for all kinds of reasons. Right. And then in terms of, let's say, did someone join MAGA because they actually believe these things or not believe these things? You'd have to ask each individual. I'm not entirely sure. Right. However, one thing that MAGA has done a really good job at is creating an identity for MAGA. Right. And human beings are identity-based creatures. We have a longing and a need to have an identity, to have a positive, affirmative identity for ourselves, and to have that identity match up and link with other human beings, right? And that's both the benefit and downside of a social movement. Because one of the things that can happen in social movements, you have groupthink, where you give up your own individual ability to think for yourself and you're just following the crowd. That can happen in all groups, all trends, right? Whether it's politics or music, it doesn't make a difference, right? Now, with the MAGA identity, I think it's less about political policy and political issues, more about a collective identity which affirms whiteness, affirms traditional gender roles, tells you that America was always good. It can still be good, except for this one group over here, or these several groups over here are making your life miserable, which is a classic example of scapegoating, right? So we've talked about trans identity. Why such a focus on trans people, right? Does a trans population actually pose an existential threat to American identity? The answer is no. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, right? But it's a way to scapegoat a population to reaffirm a certain sense of identity for white, cis, straight, traditional Christian people, so on and so on and so on. So I think with the MAGA crowd, it's less about the political policy and more about the identity formation. And that itself has a certain kind of allure relative to its collective vibe that gives off when you go to these rallies and Trump speeches and whatnot, things like that.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Erica Chenoweth,
Yep.
who said that basically, if you have 3.5% of a population that is supportive of or engaged in a movement, that's all you really need to create social change. What do you think actually helps a social movement to become successful? Because, Dr. E mentioned the Target boycott. And I just look at previous, maybe the people who were protesting against the Vietnam War or against apartheid or the Montgomery bus boycott. And I think that maybe what made those movements successful may not be the same things that would make a movement now successful with the advent of social media. But what do you think really makes a social movement in 2020, in this day and age, successful? Do you think social media helps a movement? Because I know you said you're not very active, but I think of like the Arab Spring, which was like a social media movement. But I also think of how social media can be um echo chamber and just replicating these negative sorts of things and then propaganda and all of that. So what do you think makes this a social movement in this day and age successful, and do you think social media can help the success, or in more cases than not it's harmful to the success of a movement?
The word that's coming to mind is sustainability. Can a collection of people, a large mass, critical mass of people, sustain itself over time? And if the answer is yes, you're more likely to have a successful movement because it's not just a trend, a flash in the pan, right? And that then ties into to social media, right? The challenge of social media is that everything's a trend now. It lasts a couple of weeks and it's gone, right? Everyone's on Twitter, everyone's on TikTok, everyone's Instagram or Facebook, and everyone's talking about this one thing for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, and then it's gone all of a sudden, right? So if that's the reality, I pose that question, if that's the reality, right? Then the question is, how can you use social media in a way that properly publicizes your movement and your politics, does it in a way that invites people to join your movement, and does it over an extended period of time and not just for the latest trend, right? If it's just a trend, we'll all talk about it for a couple of weeks, but then it's gone, right? But real social change takes time. I mean, it does, right? And that's not what people want to hear nowadays because we're so accustomed to things being so fast. But social change takes years, if not decades, if not centuries to create. And that's part of being a human being, right? And the question is like, well, am I fully committed to this social change, not just now in my life, but for future generations, right? And to put, I always say this to my class and put it on myself, the world that I want to see, I will never see in my lifetime. It's just not going to happen, right? That's the reality of it. But that doesn't stop me from doing what is necessary now to create that reality one day later on in the future. Right now, to bring this back down to what I said before. So the quick answer is, I think, sustainability. How can you create a movement that's sustainable, not just for weeks and months, but for years? And that gives you a better opportunity to be successful.
That's so tough. It's so tough for for people that actually use, and the majority of the people that are using social media or young generation. It's so tough for them to even stick to one task for
Yeah,
weeks at a
I
time.
agree. So the
Imagine,
idea of like boycotting is so like, why would we boycott? Why would we? But back in the day, I just feel like people were more committed. Maybe that's not true, but I agree, Dr. E.
and yeah,
Well,
people.
I think this is where education comes into play, not just classroom education, but education in general. Like, how do we educate the general population, but in this case, younger people, on the importance of the long journey ahead of us, right? And when you're younger, and I'm saying kid in an affectionate way, but when you're a kid, you don't really think about that, right? But for myself, who's now in my early 50s, I have a moral obligation to stress that with my students and people in general, right? A certain kind of wisdom comes with age, right? And me studying social movements, like, look, if you're serious about this, then be serious about it. Just don't do it for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, right? Commit to it and follow through. Right? And that's my take on it anyway.
And I find it interesting because back then people would die. People would be willing to die
Yeah.
for what they believe in. And now I don't think you would get that same level of commitment from those who are using social media. I think it's like, okay, you know what, I believe in that, but I'm not willing to, not eat for a long time or sacrifice my own well-being.
It's
Um,
fascinating why we're not like that. But I would say, and I would be interested, Dr. J, if you've seen this in your classrooms, I do think students are always at the helm of social movements, and there's so much like student-led activism. And I don't know what happens to us as we get older. Unless I don't know, they say as you become older, you become more conservative in your views and your values. But there's a fearlessness that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and I was looking at, at Columbia, the students at Columbia were the first to, be engaged in pro-Palestine protests. And I just find that really fascinating because these students are so brave, whereas people who are double their age, triple their age, would not be doing a lot of the things that they're doing, even if they believe those same things. So it's like, I do think students are always at the helm, oftentimes at the helm of these social movements and young people. Um, and so it's just really interesting to see how that is trying to be stifled within higher education because that's the place where students really like where you see a lot of things really emerging when you look at like social movements.
Yeah. So a couple of responses here. So going back to what Eli said earlier about, back in the day, people willing to leave their lives, things like that and whatnot. Now that may or may not be true. I don't really know. I mean, yes, there's obviously famous examples of this, right? But nonetheless, one of the problems with social media is that our social relations aren't as deep, generally speaking, right? Whereas when you're working face to face with people on a regular basis, you become more invested in their well-being and vice versa, right? You're more willing to sacrifice because of those face-to-face relations. Nowadays, when most of our interactions on social media, yeah, you care about people that you're friends with on social media, but you don't have the same emotional investment with them. You just don't. It's not possible. You're looking at a screen as opposed to a set of eyeballs sitting across from you, right? So I think that's part of the shift in terms of social movements as well, right? Because so much activity happens online nowadays, may not be as invested in each other as they were back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and whatnot, right? But then tying this back to what Janice was saying, there's something unique about being young where you are more fearless. You haven't seen as much sorrow, as much death, as much loss. As you get older, you realize I'm not here forever. It's going to all end at one point, right? The people I love could pass away at any point in time, and because of that, you become more attached to them, and because of that, you're less likely to take risks out in public because you're worried about something happening to you, right? And so there's a variety of complex factors happening here, both historically, right, psychologically, emotionally, the overall political context right now. It definitely makes a difference, right? All these things affect the nature of social movements in the year 2026.
I was wondering, do you think, it's hard to look into the future, but 5 years from now, do you think there's going to be some other factor that may affect how we are committed to what we believe in or our vibes? Or do you think it's probably going to be the same trend based off of what we know now? If you look to look into the
Well,
future, yeah.
yeah, I mean, this is okay. So there are two sides of my personality. One side's very much a realist, and because of that, makes me cynical. The other part of my side is very idealistic, and I see what we could become if we chose to be that. Right? Right now, it's not looking so good. I'm not. It's not looking so good. Right? It's just not. Right? The collapse of the American empire, the collapse of the American economy, climate catastrophe, so on and so on and so on. I know those things are good. Right? However, if I look at history, human beings always find a way to overcome, right? In the face of catastrophic conditions, human beings will rise up and find a way not just to survive, but to also thrive. I'm hoping that's what happens, right? And I guess if we extend the timeline long enough, that will happen at some point. I'm not sure in the next 5 years, right? Could be 50 years, 500 years, I don't know. But I do have a strong, deep faith in the spirit of human beings to overcome, right? Now, again, I don't know in the next 5 years. Next 5 years isn't looking so good, all right? But I'm hopefully, but okay. Having said that, there are also points throughout history where certain things pop up that we never saw before. Like we didn't know they were going to happen, right? So the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter 1.0, then 2.0. Right? I mean, like all these things, all these movements pop up, and it wasn't on anyone's radar. And all of a sudden, overnight, people taking to the streets. So you can never discount the ability of human beings to rise up when it's the least expected. And hopefully that happens.
I agree. I think what keeps me going is looking back in history and seeing what people endured, and especially like in this country, Black people. I'm like, getting hosed down and chased by dogs is not something that I see myself being able to endure. But they were willing to put themselves in these situations and they were able to overcome. And so maybe 20 or 30 years from now, the kids will be like, how did they endure the collapse of how did they endure what they endured? So that actually gives me a lot of hope. But I'm so curious about your personal thoughts and maybe even what you teach your students about. I know there's this conversation about the effectiveness of movements if they're nonviolent, right? There is some people who feel like if movements don't involve violence or don't involve some sort of violence, they're not going to be effective. And they look through history and around the world, movements that have been successful have often involved violence. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Do you think that in this day and age, um, nonviolent movements have a higher chance of being successful? Or do you feel, I'm thinking of, there's a quote that's attributed to Thomas Jefferson that he didn't really say, I guess, but it's like the tree of liberty must be refreshed by the blood of something like that. And it's just essentially like every now and then blood has to be shed in order for, change to happen. What are your thoughts on that, on the effectiveness of nonviolent movements versus maybe more violent movements?
Great question. And this question does come up in my classes quite often, as you said, right? I don't think it's black and white. I don't think it's clear cut. Right? Um, I am not necessarily an advocate of violence. At the same time, though, I recognize that in certain situations, violence may be the only means by which one can achieve their freedom and liberation. Right? Ideally speaking, we'd go about social change non-violently. The reason why that works, at least potentially, is that when people in society see non-violent people being beaten and killed, it has a psychological effect. And they tend to identify with the victim as opposed to the assailant and the abuser. So it's a way to persuasively bring those people onto your side and see the world through your eyes. Right? Conversely, without the threat of violence, the question then becomes, will governments and militaries take you seriously? Right? If you pose no actual physical threat to their power, why would they concede power? And I'm posing this so abstractly because it's not black and white, right? And oftentimes you'll have the co-presence of a non-violent faction and a violent faction, and they coexist in the same time and space, and they pose different challenges to the power structure. Right? Additionally, it's my own personal take here. If someone's being oppressed, it's not my job to tell them how to get their liberation. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm the one that's oppressed, then it becomes my responsibility to decide for myself. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you not to use this tactic or that tactic because I'm not the one who's oppressed, right? And that's my honest response to it. And I think anyone says different, it's like, well, you're not the one being oppressed, so is it really your place to tell them what to do? Now, you can have a discussion, you can have an intellectual debate about this, but until you're in that situation, one, you don't know what you're going to do, and you don't know what's going to work.
You don't know. You can't tell someone how to respond too.
Right.
It's hard to tell someone how to respond. But I find that interesting here. And this is probably totally different from what we were talking about. But when we look at and I look at social media a lot, and I whenever I see something, I find that interesting. Like, let's say the NBA playoffs, right? And I know we're going from one spectrum to the next, but when I was looking at the Knicks fans throughout the playoffs, they were winning, but they were willing to fight and cause a ruckus out in the street. Do you think, there's a side in which even if a city or a franchise have not won in so long, that they're willing to, whether they win or lose, they're willing to fight and or be happy in terms of using aggression? Do you think that vibe is slightly different from a vibe of what I have to get it by any means, and this is what I care for in terms of what I believe in, my religious or my political beliefs, and I'm going to die for it? Is it pretty much the same, or is it totally different in terms of how one group of people is willing to react to
Right.
an event or a season?
I guess I picture it as like a Venn diagram where there's overlapping parts to it, right? So I do not agree with sports fans trashing their city and using violence on other people, regardless of they win or lose. It doesn't make any sense. It's a sport. It's a game. So have fun. Right? I really don't. I think it's ridiculous. Right. Then additionally, there's also the mob mentality, whereas you have a couple people that start doing this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden everyone starts doing it. And that's just, again, that's common to being human. Right. Having said all of that, I do think there's a difference though between the aggression of fans and the aggression of activists and social movements, right? With social movements, ideally speaking, it's for a political purpose and you're trying to achieve a certain kind of concrete goal. With sports fans, what are you trying to achieve in this moment by using aggression, right? Other than because you had a bad day at work or something like that, right? Now, though, if we look at this through the lens of the vibe, though, the vibes can be similar, right? There's a certain kind of, let's say, contagion or contagious effect that happens, right? You're with a group of people, certain people in that group start doing certain things, it gives off a certain kind of vibe, and that vibe, literally, it pulls you in without you even consciously recognizing it. Like all of a sudden now you're doing it, and tomorrow you wake up and you're like, why did I do that? I don't know why I did that, right? Now, one of the things, though, about sports fandom that I think is fascinating, I think why it's fun to be a sports fan, is that you feel like you're part of the team. And when your team wins and loses, you win and you lose. That's what makes it fun. And you feel like you can affect the outcome of the game, right? And that's definitely a sports vibe. There's no doubt about that. Like, and I think that's a big part of sports, right? You sit in the stands or even home by yourself watching on television, and you live and die with your team. Like literally. So I'm a New York Giants fan, football fan. Since I was 11 years old, I live and die with my team, and they've been horrible for 15 years. Right? My Sundays are dictated by the Giants. When we win, I'm in a good mood. When we lose, I'm a horrible mood. Right? And talk about the vibe in the household. The vibe in the household is all screwed up. Well, the vibe in the house is going to be really awesome for everyone in the household or really bad for everyone based on my vibe and my team. Right? So again, there are overlaps between the collective vibes of social movements and sports fandom.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me because I'm from Virginia originally, and we don't have teams, but a lot of our players play for big name teams. So I never really understood the like because we don't have any team. We have the Redskins or whatever the Challengers or whatever they're called now.
Commanders, yeah, Commanders, yep.
Yeah, Commanders, but it's like they weren't, it's like a DMV. It wasn't Virginia specifically. So we don't have teams. So it's like I'm fascinated by it's just so the identity that people have when you become a fan of a team. It's like you said, Dr. J, like you're part of them. You can control the outcome when they win and being willing to fight people in the street because I saw that some Knicks fans were fighting the Pistons fans or there was something
Or
going on and I just am like, but you have no best. I mean, maybe you put money in the game, but other than that, it's just so fascinating. I'm like, you're willing to fight people for it's just I guess I don't understand it because um I don't have that connection with a team.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where critical reflection comes into play. Right. So I'm the vibe guy, I'm all that vibes, things like that. But I think we also need to critical or critically reflect upon the nature of vibes and how they can affect us. Right. So vibes can have a subconscious effect upon our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Right. And in the case of, let's say, Nick fans getting into fights with other fans, I think it's ridiculous. I totally disagree with that. But in that case, I think you got sucked into the sports vibe too much. Right? It's just a game, right? No one should be dying because of this team. It shouldn't be happening, right? And the same thing can be said though for, let's say, mass movements and the negative mass movements, right? So why are certain people attracted to white supremacy? Why are certain people attracted to male supremacy? Why are certain people attracted to homophobia? And you get in these collectives, what Eli was talking about earlier, and it's like you become caught up in this vibe because it makes you feel a certain kind of way. In that moment, we should stop and self-reflect and ask ourselves, what is happening here? Why am I attracted to this particular type of ideology, this politics, or this sports team, whatever it is, and try and parse that out in your own mind and make a proper choice that hopefully makes the world a better place, not a worse place. Uh,
And I just realized I said Pistons, but I think I meant it wasn't the
yeah,
Pistons, whatever the other team is,
yeah.
y'all know. But
It's all right.
Eli, you want to wrap up with your final question?
Oh yeah, I always ask all of my guests this question here. For you, Jason, let's say we have an aspiring professor or someone who is looking forward to study communication in the way that you are doing. What is one major skill set, or um, what is one major lesson that you have learned growing up in which you would tell that person, or you wish to tell yourself, knowing what you know now, when you were growing up to study communications and vibes and whatnot? What is one major skill set or one major lesson that you have learned over the years?
well, I'm not sure if it's about being a professor or studying a particular field, but I think it's more of a philosophy of life, and that's to be genuine and authentic to who you are as a person. Right. So if I was to give advice to my younger self or to any of my students right now, I would say, well, learn learn about yourself, learn about your wants, your needs and interests, and spend time thinking about what makes you whole as a human being. And then how can you embody and emanate a certain kind of vibe of authenticity, of integrity, and be genuine to you as a human being. And I say that, one, because I think that makes for better human beings, well-rounded human beings. But then two, when I look at the world right now, we lack that. We lack people with integrity, and we lack people with authenticity. And we need that now more than ever. And if you can do that, then I can respect you. We can disagree, but now we can have an open, honest discussion about what we disagree with, as opposed to if we're both lying to ourselves, not being true to ourselves, then where do we go from there? Like, what happens to the social fabric of America or the world at large? So I think that's what's important.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. I think integrity is something, especially in this country. I feel like we're seriously lacking, and it's hard to find people who won't do things just for a quick buck. Um so it's I agree with you 100%. And I think that's what makes some people um attracted to certain characters on social media who, but social media is tough because you can't really tell who the charlatans are. But it's, it seems like some people are very authentic, and that's why others are drawn to them. But I love that answer. But thank you so much, Dr. J. It's like time went by really quickly. We had a
Well,
million
thank you to
other
both of you. I thought it was a super fun conversation. It was a really, you never know what you're going to get when you do these interviews and whatnot. It was super fun,
Yeah,
super interesting, really good questions, a lot to think about. So
yeah.
thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and when does your book come out?
It's actually available now for pre-order, but the
Okay.
technical release is
Mhm.
December. So if people just Google
December. Okay.
Vibe Talk book, they'll find it on Amazon and Bloomsbury, things like that. So you can pre-order, but it technically comes out in December.
Okay. Perfect. Well, good luck. We can't wait to read it. And it's been great to talk to you and learn more about you and your work. And so yeah, I guess that's where we're gonna sign off. I'll pass it over to you, Doc.
All right, this is the boardroom, the academic boardroom, and we are signing out right now.
Mind of a scholar and a business-minded soul. We at the academic boardroom, yeah, we keeping it 100. If you're looking for the truth, well, you finally found it. Take a seat at the head